The dust did not care who she was. It settled on her like a second skin, a shroud of grit that filled the cracks in her lips and the hollows of her eyes. She was tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town, a single street of raw lumber buildings that squinted in the hard, white sun. Her feet were bare, the skin on them broken. Her dress, once a thing of some color, was now just a rag of faded gray that clung to her thin frame like wet paper. She did not look at the faces that passed, the men who spat in the dirt near her feet, the women who pulled their children closer and whispered behind their hands. Their judgment was just another layer of dust, and she had learned to carry its weight. She kept her gaze fixed on a loose board in the saloon porch across the way, focusing on the way the wood had splintered, a tiny world of canyons and ridges. It was a thing to hold on to when everything else was gone. The crowd was a restless animal. It had gathered in the morning, drawn by the novelty of a man leaving his property tied in the square. A lesson, he had called it, for insolence. Now, in the late afternoon, the sun had baked the interest out of most of them. They drifted away in ones and twos, back to their routines, their curiosity sated. A few remained, leaning against posts, their faces impassive, as if watching a fence weather. They were part of the landscape now, no different from the wind that lifted strands of her dark hair and let them fall again. She was an object, a piece of forgotten cargo, and her humiliation had become mundane. The silence that fell was worse than the whispers. It was a heavy, open thing, a silence that expected an ending. From the shadows of the livery, a man watched. He had been there for hours, a statue carved from dust and regret. Elias was his name, though few in this town used it. He was the man from the hollow, the one who carried whole winters in his eyes. He wore a worn duster the color of the earth, and his boots were scuffed gray. He had come to town for salt and flour, a trip he made only when the cupboards were bare, but the sight of the girl at the post had stopped him. He saw not the insolence the man Brant had shouted about, but a stillness that was older than defiance. It was the quiet of a thing that has learned it cannot win, only endure. He watched the last of the onlookers lose interest. He watched the sun dip lower, turning the dust to gold. He saw her tremble, a flicker of motion in the cooling air, a signal of life that pained him. Brant swaggered out of the saloon then, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance. He was a man built of bluster, his belly straining the buttons of his vest. He looked at the girl as one would look at a stubborn mule. "Had enough yet?" he called out, his voice thick. She did not answer. She did not move. Her world was the splintered board on the porch. Brant laughed, a short, ugly sound. He untied the rope, jerking it so she stumbled forward, her knees hitting the hard-packed earth. He coiled the rope, his movements proprietary and cruel. "Another night of it might learn you some manners," he muttered, more to himself than to her. That was when Elias moved. He did not stride or hurry. He just emerged from the shadows, his steps measured and quiet on the dusty street. He stopped a few feet from them, his presence solid and undeniable. He did not look at Brant. His eyes were on the girl, on the raw, red lines the rope had left on her wrists. Brant turned, startled. "What do you want, hollow man?" Elias lifted his gaze, and the weariness in his eyes seemed to silence the street. His voice, when it came, sounded like it came from under floorboards, low and unused. "I'll take her." Brant stared, then barked another laugh. "Take her? She ain't for sale. She's mine. Payment for a debt." He jerked a thumb toward the girl. "And she ain't worth a damn." Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small leather pouch and loosened the drawstring. He shook 3 silver coins into his palm. They were not much, but they were almost all he had. "I'm clearing your debt," he said. "Not a question. A statement." He held his hand out. The coins shone dully in the fading light. Brant looked from the coins to Elias's face. He saw no anger, no challenge. He saw something harder to argue with, a finality. It was a fool's bargain, and Brant was no fool. He was getting something for nothing. He snatched the coins from Elias's palm, his greed overriding his pride. "She's your problem now," he spat and turned his back, stalking toward the saloon without a second glance. Elias stood there until the saloon doors swung shut. The street was empty now, save for him and the girl on the ground. He looked down at her. She hadn't moved. She was still staring at the ground, a huddled knot of gray cloth and dark hair. He had done the thing, but he did not know what came next. He knelt, not too close, and held out his hand. Not to touch her, but just as an offering. She flinched. He drew his hand back. He slid the blade of his pocketknife from its worn casing. The click it made was loud in the silence. He reached forward slowly, carefully, and sawed through the coarse rope binding her wrists. The fibers parted, and the rope fell away. Her hands remained pressed together, as if the rope were still there. He stood, pocketing the knife. He waited. For a long time she did not move. Then, slowly, as if testing bones she was not sure would hold her, she pushed herself up. She stood before him, swaying slightly, her gaze still fixed on the ground between them. She was thin as a fence rail. Elias turned and started walking. He did not look back to see if she was following. He just walked, his boots raising little puffs of dust that lifted behind them like ghosts. The journey was a silent one. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruise of purple and blood orange that slowly deepened to black. A sliver of moon rose, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains. The wind turned mean, whispering cold threats against their skin. Elias walked at a steady, slow pace, a pace that did not tax her. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He simply moved forward, a dark shape against the dying light. After an hour, he stopped. He unslung his canteen and took a short drink, then held it out to her. She watched the canteen for a long moment, her eyes dark and unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she took it. Her fingers were cold. She drank, the sound of her swallowing seeming to fill the vast emptiness around them. She handed it back, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. It was the first time they had touched. He said nothing, simply slung the canteen over his shoulder and started walking again. She followed, a shadow drawn to a slightly larger shadow. His home was not a house so much as a scar on the land. It was a small cabin of weathered wood, hunkered down against the wind in a shallow hollow. A crooked porch, a stone chimney, and two windows like vacant eyes stared out into the darkness. There was a barn, listing slightly to one side, and a fenced-in plot of earth where two simple wooden crosses stood, stark against the night sky. The place was clean, kept, but it held a silence deeper than the one on the prairie. It was the quiet of loss. He pushed open the cabin door. Creaked, a sound of protest. Inside it was dark and cold. He moved with a familiar economy, lighting a lantern on the rough-hewn table. The light bloomed, pushing the shadows into the corners. The cabin was one room, a stone hearth, a bed in one corner, a table with two chairs, and a few shelves holding tins and sacks. Everything was spare, functional, and worn smooth by use. It was a place for surviving, not for living. He gestured toward the hearth. "Fire," he said, his first word to her since the town. He went outside to the woodpile. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. The place smelled of wood smoke, old sorrows, and dust. It was a man's space hollowed out by absence. She saw a small chest at the foot of his bed, and on it, a folded woolen blanket. It was a child's blanket, woven with faded blue and white stripes. He came back with an armload of wood, dropping it into the hearth box with a clatter. He worked without looking at her, arranging the kindling and logs with practiced hands. Soon, a small fire was catching, its small pops and crackles a fragile defense against the oppressive quiet. The light danced on the walls, making the cabin seem to breathe. He straightened up and turned to her. He pointed to a narrow door she hadn't noticed before. "That room is yours. There's a cot." He paused, his gaze going to the latch on the main door. "I don't lock doors." The words hung in the air. It was not a welcome. It was a contract. A statement of terms. You are safe here. You are not a prisoner. She gave a single, small nod, the first acknowledgement she had offered. She walked to the small door and slipped inside, closing it gently behind her. Elias stood by the fire, listening. He heard no sound from the room. He took a tin of beans from the shelf, opened it, and set it near the embers to warm. He ate half, his movements slow and tired. He left the other half in the tin by the fire, where it would stay warm. Then he took the child's blanket from the chest, unfolded it, and hung it over the back of the second chair. He banked the fire for the night and lay down on his bed, fully clothed, staring into the flickering darkness. The house felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The days that followed fell into a rhythm born of necessity and silence. Elias would rise before the sun, his movements quiet, and tend to his few animals. When he came back inside, the floor would be swept. A small, almost invisible gesture. He would leave a piece of hardtack or a bowl of porridge on the table and go out again to work the land, mending the fences that the wind was always trying to claim. When he returned for the midday meal, she would be gone, out wandering the hollow. But there would be a pail of fresh water by the door. They worked in parallel, two planets in a silent orbit around the small star of the cabin. He observed her from a distance. He saw her one afternoon standing by the two graves. She stayed for a long time, her head bowed. The next day, he saw a single stubborn prairie wildflower tucked into the earth at the base of the smaller cross. His son's grave. A knot tightened in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself in years. He said nothing. She watched him, too. She saw the way his hands, though chapped and calloused, were gentle with the nervous mare in the barn. She saw the weariness that settled in his shoulders at the end of the day, a weight that seemed heavier than simple labor. She saw him clean and oil a small rifle, his movements precise and reverent, before placing it back on the hooks above the mantelpiece. One evening, a storm rolled in, a furious assault of wind and rain that lashed against the cabin. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain beat a frantic tattoo on the roof. Elias sat by the fire, mending a piece of harness leather. The door to her room was closed. Through the sound of the storm, he heard another noise, a thin, sharp gasp. He stopped his work. He listened. Another gasp, followed by a muffled sob. A nightmare. He did not get up. He did not go to her door. To offer comfort felt like a trespass, a claim he had no right to make. Instead, he simply sat in his chair, his hands resting on the half-mended leather, and kept watch. He sat there all night, a silent sentinel, listening to the storm outside and the smaller storm within. When the rain finally stopped and the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, the sounds from her room had ceased. He felt a profound, aching exhaustion, as if he had weathered both storms himself. That morning he made 2 mugs of chicory coffee, bitter and hot. He placed one on the table outside her door. He did not knock. He just left it there and went out to the barn. When he came back, the mug was gone. The thaw was slow, almost imperceptible, like the first hint of green after a long winter. Came in small gestures. She found a stash of thread and a needle in his wife's old sewing box and began mending his worn shirts, her stitches small and neat. He found a pair of his wife's old boots, too large for her, but sturdy, and left them by her door, the leather softened with oil. One night, as he was carving a piece of scrap wood by the fire, she came out of her room and sat in the other chair. It was the first time she had done so. She did not speak, just watched the flames. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty. It was shared. "The bread I made yesterday," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was little dry. She looked at him. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a fragile, fleeting thing. "You didn't complain about mine." He looked down at the piece of wood in his hands, surprised by her voice, by the hint of dry wit. "Yours didn't fight back." The quiet that followed was comfortable. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. A week later, she approached him while he was splitting logs. She held something in her hands. It was the child's blanket, the one he had left on the chair that first night. She had taken it into her room and he had not seen it since. Now she held it out to him. It had been washed. The colors seemed a little brighter. And in one corner, where a moth had eaten a small hole, she had stitched a careful patch, a small square of dark blue cloth that stood out against the faded stripes. He stopped, the axe held loosely in his hand. He looked at the mended blanket, then at her. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, they were not filled with fear or emptiness. They were just clear. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "Why did you take me?" Elias looked away toward the two graves on the hill. The question was a stone dropped into the deep well of his grief. He thought of his wife, taken by a fever. He thought of his son, small and frail, who had followed her a year later. He thought of the silence they had left behind. The hollow was too quiet, he said. It was the truest thing he had ever spoken. She seemed to understand the universe of loss contained in those words. She simply nodded, folded the blanket, and laid it carefully on the clean-hewn stump of a log. She did not take it back to her room. She left it there, in the shared space between them, a bridge built of wool and thread. The harbinger came on the wind. Elias smelled the dust of shod horses long before he saw them, a scent that didn't belong in his hollow. He was on the roof of the barn, replacing a shingle loosened by the storm, and he froze, his hammer held aloft. On the horizon, a small clutch of riders moved against the vast blue sky. 3 of them. They were moving deliberately, following the faint track that led to his land. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He climbed down the ladder, his movements swift and certain. He did not need to guess who it was. The past had a long memory. He walked into the cabin. She was kneading dough on the table, her hands dusted with flour. She looked up when he entered, her eyes questioning the sudden tension in his frame. "Go to your room," he said, his voice low and flat. "Stay there." She saw the look on his face, a shuttered hardness he hadn't worn in weeks. Fear, cold and familiar, pricked at her skin, but it was different now. It was mixed with something else, a fierce, protective anger. For him, for this quiet place they had built. She wiped her hands on her apron and retreated into the small room, but she did not close the door completely. She left it open a crack, her eye pressed to the narrow slit of vision. Elias took the rifle from the hooks above the mantel. He checked the load, the action smooth and familiar in his hands. He walked out onto the porch and stood there, waiting. The rifle he held loosely at his side, not as a threat, but as a fact. The riders came on. Brant was in the lead, flanked by 2 hard-faced men Elias didn't recognize. They pulled up a dozen yards from the cabin, their horses stamping and blowing in the sudden quiet. Brant's face was a mask of smug certainty. He had the law, or his version of it, on his side. "Hollow man," Brant called out, his voice slick with contempt. "I've come for my property." Elias did not move. His gaze was steady. "She's not property. And she's not yours." Brant laughed, a sound that grated on the stillness of the hollow. "I have a bill of sale, a debt marker from her father, paid in full. She belongs to me fair and square. You stole her," he gestured to the men beside him. "We're here to take her back." "This is my land," Elias said, his voice still quiet, but carrying a weight that the wind could not disperse. "You're not welcome on it." "You can't stop us," Brant sneered, his hand moving to rest on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "It's 3 against 1. From inside the cabin, she watched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the rifle in Elias's hand, the grim set of his jaw. She saw Brant's cruel smile. The old terror washed over her, the feeling of being a pawn in a game played by angry men. But then she looked at Elias, standing alone on that porch, a bulwark against the world for her sake. And something inside her, something that had been dormant for a lifetime, broke free. She pushed her door open and stepped out into the main room. Her eyes scanned the cabin, searching. She saw the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. Her hand closed around its cool, solid weight. It was not a weapon she knew how to use, but it was heavy. It was real. Elias heard the floorboard creak behind him. "Stay inside," he commanded, not taking his eyes off Brant. "No," a voice said. The word was clear and strong. It was her voice. He risked a glance over his shoulder. She was standing in the doorway behind him, the fire poker held tight in both hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fire he had never seen before. She was terrified, but she was not hiding. She was standing with him. A strange feeling washed over Elias, something fierce and warm in his chest. He was no longer just a man defending a principle. He was a man defending his own. He turned his gaze back to Brant, and a slow, cold smile touched his lips. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "It's not 3 against 1. Brant's sneer faltered. He looked from Elias's hard face to the girl in the doorway, a defiant specter with an iron poker. It was ridiculous. He had the men, the guns. But something had shifted. The equation had changed. He was about to give the order, to push the confrontation to its bloody end, when his horse shied violently. Then the other horses did, their ears twitching, their eyes wide. A sound had begun, a low thrumming that was felt more than heard, the sound of the earth itself awakening. Elias heard it too. He looked past Brant toward the high rim of the hollow. And he saw them. Lining the ridge, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, was a line of riders. They were not settlers. They were warriors, sitting motionless on their ponies, their forms lean and powerful. They held lances, and the sun glinted off the tips. They were silent, watchful. There were not a dozen or 50. The line stretched across the entire ridge, a living fence of grim-faced men. Hundreds of them. They had appeared from nowhere, as if the land itself had given birth to them. Through the crack in the door, she saw them too. A choked sob escaped her lips, a sound of disbelief and homecoming. Her people. They had not forgotten. They had been watching. Brant and his men stared, their faces draining of color. The arrogance and bluster evaporated, leaving behind a raw, primal fear. Their 3 guns were a joke against the silent army on the ridge. The warriors did not move. They did not shout. They did not need to. Their presence was a judgment, absolute and final. One warrior, taller than the rest, with an eagle feather in his hair, slowly raised his hand. It was not a threat. It was a dismissal. Brant understood. He wrenched his horse's reins, his face a pasty mask of terror. "Let's go," he croaked to his men. They needed no encouragement. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, their retreat frantic and undignified, kicking up a cloud of panicked dust. Elias stood on the porch watching them go. He did not lower the rifle until they were a distant smudge on the plains. The girl, Lena, stepped out beside him, the iron poker hanging loosely in her hand. Together, they looked up at the ridge. The warriors remained for a long moment, a silent promise. The one with the eagle feather, her father, her brother, he did not know, met Elias's gaze across the distance. He gave a single, slow nod. Acknowledgement, respect, a debt observed. Then, as one, the line of riders turned and melted back into the landscape, vanishing as silently as they had appeared. The hollow was quiet again. The only sound was the wind whispering through the grass. The threat was gone, vanquished not by a bullet, but by a presence, by a bond that ran deeper than law or property. Elias finally lowered the rifle. He leaned it against the cabin wall. He turned and looked at her. Her name was a question in his mind, a thing he had no right to, but wanted all the same. She was looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The fire he had seen in them was still there, but it was softer now, mingled with a profound relief. "You didn't run," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Neither did you," she whispered. In the quiet aftermath, a new foundation settled between them, solid and unshakable, built not on words, but on the shared ground where they had made their stand. He felt the weight in his shoulders, the one he had carried for years, begin to lift. He was not just the man from the hollow anymore, and she was not just the girl from the town square. The sun began to set, casting long, warm shadows across the porch. The air grew cool. Elias looked at the woman beside him, truly saw her for the first time not as a duty or a responsibility, but as a person who had stood with him against the dark. Her resilience was a thing of stark beauty, like a wildflower blooming on a rock face. He cleared his throat. "I don't know your name." It was not a demand. It was a humble request, an admission that he knew nothing of her, yet he had been willing to stand for her. She looked toward the ridge where her people had been, then back at him. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and soft. "Lena, Lena." The name settled in the quiet air of the hollow. It was a simple name, but it felt like a key turning in a lock. It gave a shape to the strength he had witnessed. It made her real. He nodded slowly. "Lena," he repeated, testing the sound of it, to fit. He turned and went back inside the cabin, leaving her on the porch with the setting sun. He returned a moment later, holding something in his hand. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. The wood was worn smooth with handling. "My son," he said, his voice thick. "He made this." He held it out to her. It was an offering of his most sacred wound, a piece of the past he had kept locked away. It was an invitation into the heart of his silence. She took the bird from his hand, her fingers gentle on the worn wood. She held it as if it were a living thing. She did not say thank you. The moment was too fragile for such ordinary words. Instead, she simply held the bird and looked at him, her eyes conveying a depth of understanding that speech could never touch. A trade had been made, a name for a memory. That night, a new ritual was born. She did not retreat to her room. After their simple meal, she brought the faded blue and white blanket, his son's blanket, the one she had mended, and laid it on the floor by the hearth. She curled up on it, her back to the warm stones, the small wooden bird resting on the floor beside her hand. She did not need the protection of a separate room anymore. The entire cabin had become a safe place. Elias sat in his chair for a long time, watching the firelight play over her sleeping form. The ghosts that had haunted the corners of the cabin were gone. The crushing silence had been replaced by the soft sound of another person's breathing. He felt the old, cold emptiness inside him begin to recede, filled by a quiet, steady warmth he had thought he would never feel again. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. He finally rose and banked the flames. He looked down at Lena, a woman who had been discarded as worthless, a woman who had stood beside him armed with nothing but an iron poker and a will of iron. He was either the kindest man she had ever met, or the most foolish. He suspected he might be both. He went to his own bed, but before he lay down, he looked around the small, rough room. It was no longer just a shelter. It was no longer a tomb for his memories. The cabin breathed again. It was, against all odds, a home. Outside, the wind whispered through the hollow, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a promise. And on the porch, sitting side by side in the moonlight, were two chairs, waiting for the dawn. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It isn't just about a man saving a girl or a band of warriors showing up at the perfect moment. It's about something quieter, something that happens in the spaces between words. It's about the silent contract of decency. It's about seeing a soul where everyone else sees an object. Elias didn't offer a grand speech or a declaration of love. He offered a coin, a bowl of stew, and a door he refused to lock. He offered her the dignity of her own space and the respect of his silence. And she, in return, didn't offer gratitude. She offered her presence. She swept a floor. She mended a blanket. She put a flower on a grave. She built a home with him, stitch by silent stitch, before they even knew what they were building. She gave him back the sound of another person breathing in the dark. "So here's your naming," Sometimes the most profound acts of love aren't shouted from the rooftops. They are quiet. They are a shared meal, a mended piece of clothing. They are the choice to stand with someone when it would be easier to walk away. It's the simple, terrifying act of giving someone a piece of your own broken past, like a small wooden bird, and trusting them to hold it gently. We are all, in our own way, tied to a post in the middle of a dusty town, waiting for someone to see past the grime and the ropes. And if you're brave enough to be the one who steps out of the shadows, you might not just save someone else. You might just find the one thing in the world that can finally make your own hollow quiet. You might find a reason to let your house breathe again.